During the 16th century, a lot of music was circulated in the form of part books. This was the common way in which they were printed, for example, and it meant that every singer would have his own part. There is a manuscript tradition in England, and quite a lot of music circulates in that form as well. But thinking about these sources tells us quite a lot about how performances would have been heard. It's a mistake to think that these sources are in fact prescriptive. Because each voice part is laid out with the text underneath the music does not mean that the only way of performing it would have been by voices. It's more the materials for performance rather than, in a 19th or 20th century sense, a set of instructions which have to be followed religiously. So it would be possible, and we know this was done in practice, for instruments to be added to the texture. A second important consideration when one comes to think about the performance of Byrd's music, and particularly about the religious music to Latin texts, is that it doesn't mean that it was performed only in the context of a church. And indeed, with the Latin music, the Catholic music, that was the one place it was not performed, because such performances would not have been legal. This music was directed at Catholic households who would have celebrated the Catholic rite in private. And that's spectacularly the case with the three settings of the ordinary of the Latin Mass, for example. And so it's quite wrong to think that any church music from the 16th century, whether we're talking about Byrd's music or whether we're thinking more broadly about the continental music by Palestrina or Lassus, for example, that this music could only be performed in the context of a religious building. On the contrary, religious music was performed in the home as domestic devotional music, and it would not necessarily be performed only by voices. Instruments could be added. In England, you would add viols, you could add an organ accompaniment, or you could even, in the most radical rearrangement of the music in the separate part books, just make it into a solo song by performing, for example, the top line vocally, and then reducing the rest of the parts to a keyboard accompaniment. So a great deal of variation is possible, and what we hear on our recording of King's College Choir singing some of Byrd's Latin church music is simply one way in which this would actually have been experienced in the 16th and early 17th centuries.